So we're in this series that we've called Lyrics of Love, looking together at the Song of Songs. I thought we'd start by reading a little bit of it this evening. So if you're happy to do so, follow along with me. I'll read from chapter 1 and verse 15 through to chapter 2, verse 7. So from 1:15 to 2:7, but as we'll try to look at a little bit more beyond that this evening. So he says, "How beautiful you are, oh, my darling. Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes are doves." And she says, "How handsome you are, my beloved. Oh, how charming. And our bed is verdant." He says, "The beams of our house are cedars, our rafters are firs." And she says, "I'm a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys." And he says, "Like a lily among thorns is my darling among the young women." But she says, "Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my beloved among the young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. Let him lead me to the banquet hall, and let his banner over me be love. Strengthen me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. His left arm is under my head, his right arm embraces me. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Now, we've said that even if the relationship between husband and wife points us to the relationship between Christ and his church, there are still good reasons for taking the Song of Songs as what it appears naturally to be, a collection of love poems which celebrate the beauty of romantic love and sexual desire between a man and a woman drawn together in marriage. And we said that regardless of whether we're married or single, we, as Christians, we need a biblical worldview, a worldview that's formed by Scripture on this particular issue. And that, in a sense, is what we're trying to open up in our evenings together. We saw something of this, I hope, last week as we started looking at the opening of the book under the title "Expressions of Desire." So, just as a quick reminder of that, after the title in chapter 1, verse 1, we very quickly hear from the woman about the goodness of sexual desire in verses 2 to 4. And we reminded ourselves there that the Bible is positive about marriage and positive about sex within marriage, and sexual desire is part of God's good creation. And that led us into thinking about the pursuit of real intimacy in verses 5 to 14. And here we get an early hint that the song still belongs to the real world, as the woman expresses a measure of insecurity, to which the man responds, affirming her beauty, to which she then responds by affirming her own affection for him, using those metaphors of perfumes and scents and so on. And that's where we got up to last week. We see this couple not only talking to each other, but affirming each other and delighting in each other. And that's what we see in our next section, the section that I've just read to us now, chapter 1, verse 15 to 2, verse 7, which we might think of as the joy of mutual affirmation. Now, what we've got going on in these verses, and I hope you heard it as I was reading it, is the lovers exchange simple compliments, and they pick up each other's words and reflect them back to each other. It's like a lovely duet as they express their delight in each other. So I'd like us to see how this plays out. So first of all, if you're following along, first of all, the man praises her beauty again in verse 15. "How beautiful you are, my darling. Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes are doves." So he compares her eyes to doves. Now, again, let's remember this is poetry. So we've got to ask, well, how's the poetry working? What's he what's in mind, and so on and so forth. And it could be that her eyes are like the eyes of a dove. It could be that he's referring to the color of the bird, or its gentleness, or its shape. It's not absolutely certain. And nor does it really matter in a sense. Again, part of the point is to try to understand how the poetry does its work on us. What is clear to most of us is how important eyes are as channels of communication. Bright eyes, sparkling eyes, shifty eyes, arrogant eyes, apprehensive eyes, dreamy eyes, tired eyes. Eyes mirror inner disposition. And hers, he says, are doves. And that's a positive. And she then returns the compliment in verse 16. How handsome you are, my beloved. Oh, how charming, and our bed is verdant. Now, verdant has to do with grass. And she's speaking here of their bed, as it were, being under the open skies, with the green leafy branches for their rafters, verse 17. Again, it's poetic language. The beams of our house are cedars, our rafters are firs. And so it's as if she's saying, this is all we need, this is all we want, to be together on the green floor of the forest with the canopy of the trees over us. And then sticking with the countryside theme, look at how she describes herself in chapter 2, verse 1. I am a rose of Sharon, she says, a lily of the valleys. Now, again, let's clock, this is figurative language. Obviously, she's not saying she is literally a stalk and petals. You know, we don't interpret this in that sense literally. So what is she saying? Is the image referring to beauty or elegance or slenderness or color or smell or a combination of those things? And again, at one level, it doesn't matter. The point is, it's poetry, it's evocative, and it's meant to draw us in. Now, actually, she's probably being a little bit modest and coy here. Apparently, a rose of Sharon was nothing that special, something common. I'm rubbish at flowers, as I think some of you will know, but just think of something like a daisy, you know, just a common daisy. So what she's saying in verse 1 here is, I'm pretty common, something like that. Now he follows that up as well as he should by saying in verse 2, like a lily among thorns is my darling among the young women. You've heard that saying, you know, a rose between two thorns. Well, you've got something similar going on here. So he turns her own words into a compliment by telling her, no, if she's a lily, she stands out from other women like a lily would in a field of thorn bushes. And then she then continues with a corresponding comparison of him to an apple tree in verse 3. Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest is my beloved among the young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. So as the woman's beauty distinguishes her like a lily among thorns, so the man appeals to her like an apple tree in a natural forest. So do you see what they're doing here? Something which is valued, a lily and an apple tree, compares to something of little or no value, thorns and wild trees. And remember, again, this is figurative language. So they're not saying that other men and women are worth nothing. The point of the descriptions is to present the emotional commitment of the lovers to each other. This is a way of saying that they have no interest in other men and women. They have eyes only for each other. Now, with verse 4, she moves away from addressing him directly into kind of like a reflection on him. So she says there in the NIV of verse 4, let him lead me to the banquet hall and let his banner over me be love. Now, this is a little bit puzzling. What is this banquet hall or banqueting house to which he brings her? It's literally could be translated house of wine. That's what it is, house of wine. And we might be tempted to think that it's their version of the local pub. But in the flow of the passage to this point, remember their love story is being played out under the skies with the floor of the forest beneath them, and the leaves of the trees above them, and the flowers around them. So this might be a reference to a vineyard rather than an indoor hall. Again, if we understand the way the poetry is working. And this banner over her, what's that all about? Well, as you can probably imagine, banner is a military image. So it may well mean that she sees him as like a royal bodyguard looking after the woman that he so deeply admires, and that the protection that he offers is love. So his flag is not a military flag in that sense. It's a flag of love, but it waves over her like a military standard, which is displayed therefore for everyone to see. Now, that could be the case. It's also possible that something actually, well, military associations don't seem to fit the context here. It seems like an unusual metaphor suddenly to be using when we've had all these kind of like country metaphors. And it may well be actually that the word banner isn't the best translation. One version translates it as gave me loving glances. And so it could be in the context translated that his desire towards her or his intention towards her is love. And I actually think there's something in that. So he's brought me to the house of wine, and his desire towards me, or he has loving intentions towards me, is, I think, the way we should understand verse 4. And the effect of this is to leave the woman somewhat overwhelmed in verse 5. Strengthen me with raisins, she says, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. And because the woman is faint with love, she asks for the refreshment of raisins and apples, and the implication, I think, is that he'll provide them for her. After all, she's just described him as an apple tree whose fruit is sweet to her taste. And then she says in verse 6, his left arm is under my head and his right arm embraces me. Now, it doesn't take too much imagination to hear her describing an intimate embrace here. And it might even be a lovemaking embrace. And at the very least, he is touching her body somewhere. So it's an intimate scene, but it's also one of protection and provision and security. And so the privacy that they've sought in the country and their mutual affirmation of each other gives way to this expression of desire. His desire towards me is love. And if we continue the passage down to verse 7, it concludes with this plea not to arouse love until the correct time. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Now, that's the first occurrence of this refrain, which occurs 3 times in the book. We'll come on to the others as we go through. And it's a plea to allow love to take its course and not to be rushed. Probably meant to be understood in the sense of not arousing physical intimacy until the time is right. And so the thought is sometimes, or if the couple are not married at this point, then here the brakes are going on. But if they are married at this point, this is an admonition to others not to push love until the appropriate moment. Don't activate the powers of love outside the confines of a committed relationship. Some commentators point out that the sounds of the Hebrew words for gazelles and does of the field recall names of God. I think this is interesting. I think I'm persuaded about this. So I won't go into the details, but gazelles in Hebrew sounds like the Hebrew for Lord of Hosts. Very, very similar in sound. And the Hebrew for does of the field in Hebrew sounds like the Hebrew for El Shaddai, which is one of God's names, God Almighty. And if that's the case, then that heightens the seriousness and the strength of her admonition. So as much as sex is a gift from God and a good to be enjoyed, it's important not to separate it from the context in which God himself has placed it, and that context that we see unfolding in these poems. So that's kind of finishing off from last week. That's expressions of desire. Just before I move on, does anyone want to kind of just reflect back on anything? Because I want to kind of move on to the next section, but I don't want to do so if there's anything that anyone wants to raise or ask or comment on. No? Great. Well, okay. Let's see how we do with the next section, because I'm calling this next section invitations to love in chapter 2 verse 8 to 3 verse 5. Invitations to love. An enduring image in romantic poetry is the lover at the window, or calling up to the rose trellised balcony, to the object of his affection, classically, of course, in Romeo and Juliet, but in countless Disney films. Not that but you know what I'm saying. I understand in countless Disney films. And what's going on in these scenes is there's a seeking, there's a desire to be together, but there's also a separation. And the Song of Songs contains these twin themes of separation and seeking. So it comes out a number of times in the poems. Sometimes it's the man who seeks the woman, and sometimes it's the woman who seeks the man. And we have these themes of separation and seeking in chapter 2, verse 8 to 3, verse 5. And this breaks really into two main parts, two poems, if you like. What I'm calling the daytime poem in verses 8 to 17 of chapter 2, and what I'm calling the nighttime poem of chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. So in the daytime poem, as we'll see, it's the man who seeks. And in the nighttime poem, it's the woman who searches for the man. So the first poem, the daytime poem, captures the woman's excitement as she eagerly anticipates the arrival of her man, as she describes him, as we'll see, as a gazelle or a young stag, and she pictures him as bounding over the mountains as he comes to her. And he's excited too as he waits outside her house, peering inside, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, and he invites her to enjoy the beauty of springtime as they see and hear and touch and smell the exciting things that come with this time of year. So he wants to be with her and to see her face and hear her voice. He's seeking the woman. Then in the second poem, in chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, he's not there. And the woman is upset and she seeks him. And for a while, she can't find him. And finally, when she does find him, she holds on to him and doesn't let him go. So both these poems begin with the two apart, but they overcome their separation, I think we're meant to understand, by the end of the poem. So that's kind of like a little way into this whole section of the daytime poem and the nighttime poem. So let's begin with the daytime poem and what we might think of as the longing for intimacy. Now, just before we go through it, I've put the whole text there on the screen. You might not be able to read that from where you are, but I think it's helpful to just to stand back and see the whole thing, to see a whole passage like this, because as we look at it, we're able to see that it begins and ends in a similar way with the same words that are repeated, and you'll see that I've highlighted them there in red type. So what that does is it kind of, think of it as, if you like, as a literary bracket, which kind of encloses this whole section. And so that marks it out as like a poem in its own right, what I've called the daytime poem. But if we look even more closely, we'll see that there's another literary bracket there in green between verses 10 to 13, where we've got the identical words being used: arise, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me, in verse 10, and then repeated in verse 13. Sorry, green might not be the best color to see that. But this whole section is very much like the rest of Song of Songs. Fruits and flowers are mentioned, vines, fig trees, vineyards, lilies, as well as animals, gazelles, stags, doves, foxes. The style is countrified and pastoral. This is pastoral poetry. So the poetry creates a kind of world of beauty and fruitfulness in our imaginations, which then is designed, as I say, to work on our emotions as we hear this longing for intimacy. So what we'll do is we'll go through the daytime poem. That might be all that we'll be able to manage this evening. Then we'll come back next time to the nighttime poem. So what we begin with an expression of hair anticipation in verses 8 and 9. So look at it with me. Listen, my beloved, look, here he comes, leaping across the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Look, there he stands behind our wall, gazing through the windows, peering through the lattice. So it's an abrupt beginning. Listen, she says. And she describes him as her beloved. And it's as if the sounds of his approach are familiar to her. You know, when someone's walking through the house and you know who it is from the sound of their footsteps on the stairs or whatever it might be, and she can identify his approach. So if she hasn't already been at the window waiting for him, she now scrambles to the equivalent of her ancient window. And she can see him. Look, she says. So she can see him making his way to her. And she can see that there's an energy and an eagerness about him. He's not just coming, he's leaping, she says, and he's bounding. And so she describes him as like a gazelle or a young stag. Now, again, we don't interpret this literally. He is not a four-legged animal. As we saw earlier with the Rose of Sharon, we're meant to ask, well, what's being suggested to us by these images? And in the culture of the time, the imagery is sensual. Gazelles and stags speak not only of agility, but virility. A handsome animal, strong, but not violent, easily excitable, sexually eager, especially in the spring. And so there's excitement and anticipation in her voice here. Look, she says again. She now sees him a little bit closer, but he's on the other side of the wall, she says, gazing through the windows, peering through the lattice. So he's not a peeping Tom, just to be clear. He's not a creepy stalker. She's already described him as a yearning young stag. So this is more like a Romeo outside Juliet's window, hoping that she'll come out to the balcony where he can see her. But the image that the poetry gives us is she's inside the house. He's outside, gazing through the window. So they're kind of together, but not fully. There's still a separation, there's still a distance between them. The distance between them is only partially bridged. Now, she seems excited by his passion. Of all the girls in the world, he's wooing her. But will she let him in? Now, in fact, he's not asking to be let in. He wants her to come away with him. And that's what we see next, which is his invitation in verses 10 to 13. These are the verses that are surrounded by those words, arise, come, my beautiful one, come with me. So he says there, my beloved's, or she actually records, my beloved spoke and said to me, arise, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me. See, the winter is past, the rains are over and gone, flowers appear on the earth, the season of singing has come, the cooing of doves is heard in our land, the fig tree forms its early fruit, the blossoming vines spread their fragrance. Arise, come, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me. And we come back to those words again, which kind of marks that off as its own little separate unit of thought. Now, notice she's still speaking, but she's describing what he says, or maybe even imagining what he might say. And what's he doing here? Well, he's giving her an invitation to come away with him. It's an invitation to union. Come, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me. And he gives her a reason. The winter is past. The rains are over and gone. It's almost spring at the moment here in the UK, but not quite. Apparently it's going to be freezing this week, but spring is on the way. And that's the imagery here. The winter's gone, spring is just arriving. And so there's a whole bundle of images here, colorful flowers, which appeal to the eyes, cooing doves, which appeal to the ears, figs, which appeal to the sense of taste, flowering vines, which appeal to the sense of smell. In other words, spring has come. And the imagery is of newness and freshness and anticipation and new life and new growth. And the association of spring and love's awakening is very common, as you might know, in love poetry through the ages and across cultures. It was Tennyson who wrote that in the spring, a young man's fancy lightly turns to thoughts of love. And so he's saying, look, here comes the sun. It's time for our love to blossom. Join me in this lush countryside that speaks of the vibrancy of love. So he's summoning all his poetic powers to win her heart. It's perhaps the equivalent of spending ages thinking about what message you're going to write in a card, you know, just to make it clear how you really feel and what you're longing for. So he's trying to persuade her that the time for romance has finally come. If the figs are ripening on the tree and the turtle doves are making their nests, then it must be the season for love. Now, I'm laboring this a little bit because some have suggested that actually this sounds like the poetic equivalent of a marriage proposal. What the man wants more than anything is to be with this woman all the time. So this is the equivalent of him proposing marriage. Others have suggested, no, it's just a more general invitation to intimacy. Or if we're to imagine that this couple are already married, as some commentators do, it's an invitation to further intimacy or maybe even sexual intimacy. And once again, because it's poetry, it can work on several levels all at once. But what is clear is that it's an invitation of some sort to her. And so that appeal comes again in verse 13, arise, come, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me. But as we read on, it seems like she might be playing hard to get, verse 14. And so we get what I'm calling, to keep with my shun words, his solicitation or petition, if you prefer. So he says there, my dove in the clefts of the rock, in the hiding places on the mountainside. Show me your face. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet and your face is lovely. Because there's a sense in which his invitation seems to be left hanging in midair. And so are we as readers. How will she respond to this invitation that he's just issued in verses 10 to 13? We're not actually told straight away. And there might be a hint of disappointment in his words here. At the start, she likened him to a gazelle or a stag, and now he likens her to a dove. But she's inaccessible to him. It's as if he captures a glimpse of her before she retreats back to her ledge, back to the crack in the cliffs. Perhaps the woman is at a loss to know how to respond to this invitation. Perhaps she's unable to come out. Perhaps she's playfully hiding behind the window. Perhaps she's teasing him. We don't know for sure what's going on in the poetry, but he's clear. He wants to see her face. Show me your face, he says there in verse 14, or it could be translated as form. Show me your form. And he wants, he says, to hear her voice because she's sweet to listen to and lovely to look at. It's a caricature, I know, but it's one of the most common complaints of wives about their husbands, that they don't listen. So like the old adage, my wife says, I only have two faults: I don't listen and something else. Or like the couple in this cartoon, your need to have a conversation about our problems is interfering with my need to pretend they don't exist. But this man wants not only to see her, he wants to hear her. But at this point, it looks like we've got an eager stag and an inaccessible dove. So once again, the poem, you see, captures this idea of absence and presence. There's this ebb and flow of separation and togetherness, which is part of their relationship. So there are moments of intimacy, but moments of apartness. But I think we can hear that he's being tender and gentle here. He's still thinking of her. He still wants to see her. He still wants to hear her. He still wants to be with her. And that brings us to verse 15, which can be seen as her response, or it could be his exhortation. So we read there in verse 15, catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom. And actually, it's very difficult to know who's speaking here, whether it's he is speaking still, following on from verse 14, what he's just said, or whether she now is responding to his solicitation, to his petition. But whoever is speaking, it fits with the overall theme of the poem. It's springtime, remember, the vineyards are in full and fragrant flower, but that only brings out the foxes. Foxes were a nuisance in springtime because they'd help themselves to the early buds appearing on the vine. Part of the job would be to shoo them away, to get rid of them. So in all the beauty of the poetry, it's another little reminder that the world of love that he's inviting her into is less than perfect. It needs guarding, it needs protecting. It's not clear who or what the foxes represent. There are all sorts of ideas that we might come up with, but it's clear that the foxes are a risk to their enjoyment of intimacy. So if the man is speaking, he might be saying to his dove, who's hiding herself, let's get rid of anything that will spoil us enjoying our fruit together. Let's deal with anything that threatens to nip the growth of our love and the expression of our intimacy in the bud. So he, or perhaps she, if it's her who's saying this, either way, they're expressing the desire that they deal with every obstacle that might prevent their relationship from progressing. Now, whether it's her voice or his voice in verse 15, it's certainly hers in verses 16 and 17, and it's an affirmation. My beloved is mine, and I am his. He browses among the lilies until the day breaks and the shadows flee. Turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or like a young stag on the rugged hills. So here, it sounds as if his wooing has worked. The poem ends with these words of intimacy on the part of the woman. My beloved is mine, and I am his. And that means if we do have, as some think, something like a proposal to marriage here, here's her response. It's a yes. These words, my beloved is mine and I am his, appear on 2 other occasions in the book. They're slightly different every time, but it's the same thought that's being expressed. And it's a refrain, if you like, which reinforces their mutual love. He belongs to her just as much as she belongs to him. So the woman can stake an exclusive claim to his affections. My beloved is mine and I am his. And it's an exclusivity that is reciprocal. So we need to notice the mutuality of it. He belongs to her, she belongs to him. And you might recognize this, actually. It's language that echoes the relationship between God and his people. Many times in the Old Testament, we read, I will be your God and you will be my people. And that's a shorthand way of referring to the special covenant relationship between God and his people. And so here she is using that covenantal language to describe their relationship. Verse 17 is complicated. You might just want to have a little look at it as we go through it. It's been taken in different ways. When she says in the middle of verse 17, turn, my beloved, what's the sense of turn? Is it turn aside and come to her, or is it turn and go away? Now, a lot depends on what you think is going on in the rest of the poem. Some see this as reflecting an episode before they're married. And so the sense is that despite their passion and their desire, this is not the time for the full physical expression of her love. She's still fully committed to him. She wants that mutual exclusive relationship with him, but now is not the moment to consummate that relationship. It's time, she says, for her young stag to turn around and go back to the hills. That's one way of taking verse 17. Others say, no, she is actually responding positively to his request for intimacy, and even perhaps sexual intimacy. And so she sings about him there in the second part of verse 16 as browsing, or grazing is almost a better translation, grazing among the lilies. And she invites him to be like a gazelle or a young stag on what the NIV translates as the rugged hills. Now, she's already described herself as a lily, and he's described her as a lily among thorns. Elsewhere in the Song of Songs, mountains and lilies are sexually suggestive. And so it seems that at least possible, if not likely, that this phrase about browsing or grazing among the lilies in verse 16 represents some close physical contact of some sort. And then in verse 8, at the start of this section, he's leaping over the mountains. But in verse 17, he is invited to be on the rugged hills. And this phrase literally is the hills of separation, which could be a poetic way of referring to her breasts. So if his language of spring was sensual, her language here is even more so. So does she accept his invitation to intimacy or not? Well, on balance, I think the text suggests that she does, but you can take it the other way. It might be ambiguous. Poetry can be ambiguous. As we said, her words here return us back to the opening lines of the poem, because there's a repetition, so that drives us back to the opening of the poem, which then carries on the theme of being apart and the invitation to overcome that. So it may well be one of those nice loops. But we're in no doubt about the man in this daytime poem. He's longing for the woman. Does she feel the same about him? Well, the next poem, the nighttime poem, leaves us in no doubt that she does. But we won't look at that this evening, because I'd like to give us just a little bit of time just to reflect together.